Why willow wood?
Burns cooler than hardwood.
You want to know what broke me? It wasn't the bullet that grazed my skull in '58, wasn't the Apache arrow that nearly took my leg in '54. It wasn't even watching my father's forge burn to the ground when I was 17 years old. What broke me was a promise. I gave my word to a man, looked him straight in the eyes, and told him his people would be safe. Told him they could travel in peace. Told him I was a man of honor. 3 days later, I watched him die holding a white flag, walking toward me like I was salvation instead of the Judas who'd led wolves to his flock. That was 5 years ago. I've been dead ever since, just a body that forgot how to stop breathing. My name is Elijah Cutter. I was a captain in the United States Army, master gunsmith, and the man who designed the defense systems for 12 frontier forts. I knew every weakness, every supply line, every military secret worth knowing. Now I shoe horses in a dusty border town, and I pray every night that nobody recognizes the ghost I've become. But here's the thing about running from your past. Eventually, your past gets tired of chasing and decides to sit down right in front of you. Mine showed up on a Tuesday evening in 1867 wearing army blue and dragging 3 Comanche prisoners behind his horse. I heard them before I saw them, the clinking of chains, the tired shuffle of feet on packed dirt, and underneath it, all the cruel laughter of men who'd forgotten what mercy meant. 5 cavalry soldiers rode into town like they owned every soul in it. Maybe they did. Out here, Army Blue was judge, jury, and executioner all wrapped in brass buttons. I kept my head down, focused on the mare's hoof I was filing. Just another old farrier with a bent back and calloused hands. Nothing to see. Nobody worth remembering. But my eyes wouldn't obey. The prisoners walked behind the last horse connected by a single chain that ran through iron cuffs on their wrists. 2 women and a child. The women kept their faces blank, that terrible emptiness that comes from knowing what's waiting for you and refusing to give your captors the satisfaction of fear. The child was different. A boy maybe 10 years old with a gash above his eyebrow that had crusted over with dried blood. He didn't look scared either, but his emptiness was something else. It was defiance, frozen solid, a hatred so pure it had burned away everything softer underneath. He caught me staring. Our eyes met for maybe 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, I saw exactly what he thought of me. Another white man, another enemy, another coward who would watch and do nothing while his people suffered. He was right about that last part. I had been that coward for 5 years. The soldiers dismounted outside the saloon, tying their horses to the rail with the casual ease of men who expected the world to wait for them. One of them, Sergeant Stripe's tobacco-stained beard, jerked the chain hard enough to make the smaller woman stumble. "Move it, squaw. Ain't got all night." They dragged the prisoners toward the back of the general store where Miller kept a root cellar with a heavy door and an iron lock. I'd seen it used as a holding cell before. Knew what happened to prisoners who spent the night there. I also noticed the insignia on their uniforms. 7th Cavalry, Colonel Webb's unit. My hammer stopped mid-swing. Colonel Marcus Webb, the man who'd burned my father's forge, the man who'd held my family's secret hostage for a decade, the man who'd turned my promise into a massacre and walked away smelling like roses while I drowned in blood, the man I'd been running from for 5 years. He's not here, I told myself. Just his men, just soldiers following orders, none of your business. I went back to filing the mare's hoof. The scrape of metal on keratin was loud in the sudden silence of the street. Everyone had gone inside, doors closing, shutters latching. Nobody wanted to see what would happen next. Neither did I. That night I lay on my cot in the back of the livery stable, staring at the ceiling and trying not to think. I failed. The sergeant's voice carried through the thin walls of the town. "Colonel wants 'em alive for questioning, but he didn't say nothing about what condition they gotta be in." Laughter. More voices, the sound of a bottle breaking. I pressed my palms against my eyes until I saw stars. Not your fight, not your problem. You're dead, remember. Dead men don't interfere. But I could still hear my father's voice from 35 years ago, standing in front of his forge with soot on his face and pride in his eyes. Any fool can pull a trigger, Eli. But crafting the gun, that's where the real power lies. The man who makes the weapon decides who lives and who dies. Remember that. It's not just iron and fire. It's responsibility. I'd spent my whole life trying to live up to those words. I'd failed. I'd let Webb turn my knowledge into a tool for slaughter. I'd given him exactly what he wanted, and when I finally refused, he'd taken everything else instead. What was left to lose? The answer came easier than I expected. Nothing. Not a damn thing. The root cellar had one guard, a young private, who'd drawn the short straw and wasn't happy about it. He sat on a barrel, outside the door rifle across his knees, fighting to keep his eyes open. I watched him from the shadows for 10 minutes, timing his head bobs, counting the seconds between each drowsy blink. When I moved the way my father taught me to move through his forge at night, weight on my toes, breath shallow, each step placed with surgical precision on the spots that wouldn't creak or crunch. The private never heard me coming. I caught him as he slumped, easing him down to the ground without a sound. His pulse was strong under my fingers, just unconscious, not dead. I wasn't ready to spill Army blood. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The cellar lock was Army issue, same as the ones I'd designed for Fort Leavenworth 15 years ago. I knew its weaknesses better than I knew my own reflection. 3 seconds with a bent nail and it clicked open. The smell hit me first, sweat and fear, and old potatoes rotting in the corner. Then my eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I saw them huddled against the far wall, chains pulled around their feet like iron snakes. The women looked up at me with flat, assessing eyes. The boy bared his teeth. "I'm getting you out," I whispered in English, then repeated it in the handful of Comanche words I'd picked up during my years on the frontier. My accent was terrible, but the meaning came through. The older woman, 30 maybe, with a scar across her chin, said something sharp and fast that I couldn't follow. "No time," I said. "Soldiers, danger, we go, now." I worked on their chains while they watched me, ready to bolt or fight, depending on which way this went. The locks were simpler than the door, 5 seconds each. When the last cuff fell away, the boy rubbed his wrists and stared at me with those burning eyes. "Why?" he asked in accented English. I didn't have an answer he'd believe. Hell, I didn't have an answer I believed. "Because I'm tired of watching," I said finally. "Move. Quiet." We made it 20 feet from the cellar before I realized we had a problem. I'd gotten them out. I had no idea where to take them. The town was small, surrounded by open desert in every direction. 3 Comanche on foot wouldn't make it 5 miles before the soldiers caught up. I had one horse, old and slow, and no supplies worth mentioning. I'd acted on instinct, and now instinct had left me standing in an alley with 3 escaped prisoners and no plan. That's when I heard the hoofbeats. Soft, careful, coming from the north end of town where the buildings gave way to scrubland and darkness. I pushed the prisoners behind me and reached for the knife in my boot, the only weapon I allowed myself these days. Whatever was coming, I'd make it expensive. The rider emerged from the shadows like a spirit taking form, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. She sat her horse like she'd been born in the saddle. No, like she'd been born part horse, and someone had just forgotten to finish the transformation. A Comanche woman, maybe early 30s, with a bow in her hands and an arrow already nocked. The arrow was pointed at my chest. Behind me, the older woman let out a cry of recognition and rushed forward, words tumbling out in rapid Comanche. The mounted woman's eyes flickered to her, widened, and then snapped back to me with twice the intensity. "He helped us," the boy said, his English careful and deliberate. "The white man. He opened the cage." The woman on horseback didn't lower her bow. Her eyes traveled over me, cataloging details, the way I stood, the calluses on my hands, the knife I held ready. I knew that look. It was the same look I used to give prisoners before interrogation, the look of someone deciding whether you were useful or dangerous. "You," she said, her accent thick but clear. "Why? Didn't like the alternative." "Not enough." I thought about lying. Thought about coming up with some noble reason that would make me sound like a hero instead of a man running from his own shadow. Instead, I told her the truth. The officer leading those soldiers, Colonel Webb, he destroyed my family when I was a boy, used me as a tool for 20 years, made me complicit in the murder of your people at Pease River 5 years ago. Her bow arm tensed. "I've been hiding ever since," I continued, pretending to be dead, letting him keep killing while I shoed horses and told myself it wasn't my business. I lowered my knife, let my hands hang empty at my sides. Tonight, I decided I was done hiding. Whatever happens next, at least I did one thing that wasn't cowardly. Silence stretched between us, broken only by the distant sounds of laughter from the saloon. The woman on horseback studied me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she lowered her bow, not putting it away, just not pointing it at my heart anymore. "I am Taabe," she said. "This woman is my husband's sister. You saved my family." Eli Cutter. I know this name. Her eyes narrowed. Cutter, the gunsmith, the one who made weapons for the army. So much for anonymity. The same. The soldiers will know you did this. They will hunt you. Probably. You have a plan. No. Something that might have been amusement flickered across her face. Then you will need one. Follow me. She turned her horse and started toward the darkness beyond town. The two women and the boy moved after her without hesitation. I stood there for 3 heartbeats, weighing my options. Stay here, and Webb's men would find me within hours. Even if they didn't connect me to the escape, I couldn't go back to being a ghost. Something had cracked inside me when I opened that cellar door. Something that had been frozen for 5 years was finally beginning to thaw. For better or worse, I was alive again. I followed the Comanche woman into the night. Taabe led us for 3 hours through terrain that would have killed a less skilled rider. She seemed to know every rock, every dry wash, every patch of brush thick enough to hide our trail. I watched her move, and despite everything, I found myself impressed. I'd spent 15 years on the frontier. I'd seen the finest horsemen the army could produce, watched Comanche warriors in battle, studied their techniques from the safety of fort walls. I thought I understood what made them dangerous. I understood nothing. Taabe didn't ride her horse. She flowed with it, a single creature with 2 minds and 1 purpose. When the terrain roughened, she controlled the animal with her knees alone, leaving both hands free. When we crossed a moonlit stretch where we might be seen, she shifted her weight forward, and the horse accelerated without any visible signal. At one point, she stopped at the top of a ridge, scanning the darkness behind us. I pulled up beside her, breathing hard. "You ride well," I said. "Best I've seen." "All Comanche ride well." There was no pride in her voice, just statement of fact. Our children sit horses before they walk. What you see is not special. It is simply what we are. "And the bow." She glanced at me, measuring. "You want to know if I can fight?" "I want to know what we're working with. If Webb comes." "When?" "When Webb comes." I amended. "I need to understand our strengths." Taabe was quiet for a moment. Then she raised her bow, drew, and fired in a single motion so fast I barely tracked it. 40 yards away, a jackrabbit that I hadn't even seen tumbled over dead. 20 arrows in 1 minute, she said, accurate to 60 yards while riding. That is what your people face when they attack our camps. She kicked her horse forward without waiting for a response. That is why they prefer to attack when our warriors are hunting, and only women and children remain. We reached her band's camp at dawn. It wasn't what I expected. No towering teepees, no elaborate decorations, just a scattered collection of hide shelters nestled in a canyon that would be invisible from more than a mile away. Practical, mobile, ready to disappear at a moment's notice. I counted maybe 50 shelters, 200 people give or take. The camp erupted when they saw us coming. Women emerged from shelters, children started running, and shouting dogs barked at the commotion. In the middle of it all, a man approached, tall, weathered, with the bearing of someone used to being obeyed. Taabe spoke to him rapidly in Comanche. I caught fragments, the soldiers, the rescue, the white man who helped. The man's eyes kept flicking to me, cold and assessing. Finally, he turned to face me directly and spoke in heavily accented English. "I am Isatai. I lead this band." He didn't offer his hand. "My sister's wife says you saved her." "Why should I believe this is not a trick?" "You shouldn't," I said. "You have no reason to trust me. All I can tell you is that the soldiers who captured your people serve a man named Colonel Webb. He's been hunting me for 5 years. If he learns I'm alive, he'll come for me too." "Then we should send you away. Let him catch you far from here." "You could do that. But here's the problem. Webb isn't coming just for me. He was bringing those prisoners here for questioning. That means he already knows where your camp is, or he's close to finding out. He won't stop just because I'm gone." Isatai's expression didn't change, but I saw the flicker of concern in his eyes. "How many soldiers does this Webb command?" 50, maybe more. And he's not stupid. He'll call for reinforcements if he thinks he needs them. "We have 30 warriors, 50 rifles, but ammunition only for 15. Isatai's voice was flat, reciting facts he already knew. "We cannot fight 50 soldiers. You can't fight them the way they expect you to fight." I took a breath. "But I know Webb. I know how he thinks, how he plans, where his weaknesses are. I've spent 20 years studying army tactics from the inside, and you will share this knowledge freely with us. Not freely. I want something in return. The suspicion in Isatai's eyes hardened into something colder. Speak. When this is over, if we survive, I want to stay. Not as a prisoner, not as a guest, as someone who contributes. I have skills that can help your people beyond this one fight. What skills? I met his gaze steadily. I can make gunpowder, not just mix it, create it from raw materials. Saltpeter from bat caves, charcoal from willow wood, sulfur from natural deposits. My family developed a formula that burns cleaner and stronger than anything the army uses. Silence fell over the gathered crowd. I could feel the weight of their attention, dozens of eyes fixed on me. I can teach your people how to make ammunition, I continued. Not just reload cartridges, manufacture them from scratch. You'll never have to depend on white traders again. Never have to surrender because you've run out of bullets. Isatai stared at me for a long moment. Then he turned to Taabe and spoke in Comanche. She answered, and they went back and forth for several minutes, while I stood there acutely aware that my life was being decided in a language I barely understood. Finally, Isatai turned back to me. You will stay. For now. Taabe will watch you. If you betray us, she will kill you. This is acceptable. I looked at Taabe. Her face was expressionless, but her hand rested on her knife. Acceptable, I said. The next 3 days were the strangest of my life. I'd spent decades as either a soldier or a ghost, always apart from the people around me. Now I found myself in the middle of a community that operated by rules I was only beginning to understand. There was no privacy, but there was also no pretension. People said what they meant, and meant what they said. When a young warrior named Quinai thought I was useless weight, he told me so to my face. When an elderly woman named Penateka decided I needed feeding, she shoved a bowl into my hands and refused to take it back until I'd eaten every bite. And through it all, Taabe watched. She assigned me small tasks, at first helping repair saddles, gathering firewood, tending horses. Nothing that would let me near weapons or sensitive information. I did the work without complaint, knowing I was being tested. On the second day, she found me examining her bow. I wasn't touching it. I knew better than that, but I was studying the construction. The curve of the wood, the sinew backing the way the limbs flexed under tension. You understand weapons, she said. Not a question. My father was a gunsmith, the best in Pennsylvania. He taught me that every weapon tells a story, who made it, how it's meant to be used, what its maker valued. What story does my bow tell you? I considered the question seriously. It's made for mounted combat. The short length lets you swing it past a horse's neck, shoot from either side. The heavy draw weight, 60 pounds, maybe more, gives you penetration at close range, enough to punch through leather armor or thick hide. But the real secret is the sinew backing it stores more energy than wood alone gives you a faster arrow with less effort. I turned to look at her. This isn't just a weapon, it's the product of generations of refinement, each improvement passed down and built upon, like my father's gunpowder formula. Something shifted in Taabe's expression. Not warmth exactly, more like the faint beginning of respect. You see clearly, she said. For a white man. I see what's in front of me. That's all. Most of your people do not. They see savages, animals, things to be removed, not understood. Most of my people are idiots. I shrugged, present company included until recently. That surprised a short laugh out of her, the first sign of genuine emotion I'd seen from her. Perhaps you are more useful than I thought, Eli Cutter. Give me a chance to prove it. The chance came sooner than either of us expected. On the morning of the fourth day, a scout rode into camp at a dead gallop, his horse lathered with sweat. The news spread through the camp like wildfire soldiers, 50 of them, maybe more. 2 days' march to the southeast, moving in a pattern that suggested they knew exactly where they were going. Webb had found them. Isatai called a council of warriors. I wasn't invited, but Taabe was, and she insisted I come along. He knows the enemy, she said when Quinai protested. Would you rather fight blind? The council was grim. The arithmetic was simple and brutal. 50 soldiers with repeating rifles against 30 warriors with limited ammunition. Even with superior horsemanship, the numbers didn't work. We can run, one warrior suggested. Break camp, scatter, meet again at the winter grounds. With 80 women and children, Another countered. The soldiers have fresh horses. They'll catch the slow ones. Then we fight. Queenai stood his jaw set. We die like Comanche, not like rabbits running from wolves. There's a third option. Every eye turned to me. I felt the hostility in the room like heat from a forge. We don't run, and we don't charge into their rifles. We make them fight on our terms, not theirs. And how do we do this? Isatai's voice was carefully neutral. Webb is arrogant. He's never lost a fight against native forces, and that's made him sloppy. He thinks he knows how Comanche fight the circling attacks, the hit-and-run raids. He'll be prepared for those tactics. I moved to the center of the gathering, drawing a rough map in the dirt. So we don't use those tactics. Instead, we use his expectations against him. For the next hour, I laid out everything I knew about Webb, his habits, his formations, his preferred methods of engagement. I explained the weaknesses in Army supply lines, the communication gaps between units, the blind spots in standard cavalry formations. And then I told them about the gunpowder. I need 3 days, I said. Give me 3 days access to a bat cave and a few people to help gather materials. I can produce enough gunpowder to reload every cartridge you have with plenty left over. We don't have 3 days, Taabe said. We have 2 at most. Then we slow them down. I looked around the circle, meeting eyes that ranged from suspicious to cautiously hopeful. Not with a direct attack, that's what Webb expects. We slow them with harassment, kill their horses if we can, steal their supplies if we can't, make them fight for every mile. Meanwhile, I'll work day and night on the gunpowder. And if it's not enough, Isatai asked, then we fight with what we have. But at least we'll have a chance. The council debated for another hour. In the end, they agreed, not because they trusted me, but because they had no better options. Sometimes being the least terrible choice is enough. What followed was the most exhausting 72 hours of my life. Taabe led a team of riders to harass Webb's column, while I worked in a shallow cave 3 miles from camp. I had 2 helpers, an old man named Tosamia, who seemed to understand what I was doing without needing explanations, and a teenage girl named Nada, who asked relentless questions about everything. Why willow wood? She asked as I built my charcoal pit. Burns cooler than hardwood, leaves a purer carbon. Why does pure carbon matter? Because impurities make the powder unstable. It might not ignite, or it might explode when you don't want it to. Has that happened to you? Once. When I was 14, burned the eyebrows right off my face. I smiled at the memory, one of the few that didn't hurt. My father laughed for 10 minutes, then made me start over. Nada grinned. I think I would like your father. He would have liked you. He had a weakness for people who asked too many questions. And the work was hard, but it was also peaceful. There's a rhythm to metallurgy, to chemistry, to the precise application of heat and pressure and time. I'd forgotten how much I loved it, forgotten how it felt to create something instead of destroy. When the gunpowder was ready, I tested it on a single cartridge. The crack of the rifle echoed through the canyon cleaner and sharper than any Army-issue ammunition. The bullet punched through a wooden target I'd set up 50 yards away, leaving a hole nearly twice the size I expected. Tosamia nodded slowly, impressed despite himself. Good powder, he said. My father's formula. I started loading the next cartridge. Now let's make enough to matter. Webb's column arrived 2 days later, but they weren't the fresh, confident force that had left the fort. Taabe's harassment had worked better than I'd hoped. The soldiers had lost 18 horses, 2 supply wagons, and what remained of their patience. They'd also lost 4 men picked off by arrows from riders they never saw, clearly attacking at dawn and dusk when visibility was worst. Webb was furious. I knew because I could hear him screaming from the ridge where I lay hidden beside Taabe, watching through a battered spyglass. He's splitting his forces, I murmured. What does that mean? He's sending 30 men around the north ridge to flank us. Probably plans to catch us in a crossfire when we attack his main group. Taabe smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach her eyes. Then we give him what he expects. The battle, if you could call it that, lasted less than an hour. We let Webb see our warriors massing at the canyon entrance, just enough to make him commit. He sent his flanking force around the ridge exactly as I'd predicted, then prepared to advance with his remaining 20 men. What he didn't know was that Taabe had sent 15 riders into positions along the flanking route during the night. They hit the flanking force from 3 directions at once, using the circling tactics Webb had prepared for, but against an enemy already exhausted, demoralized, and separated from support. Meanwhile, the main group walked straight into an ambush of a different kind. I'd spent the previous night with 2 volunteers seeding the canyon approach, with surprises hidden pits tripwires attached to falling rocks, and 3 precious charges of my powder buried at choke points. The first explosion killed no one, but it destroyed Webb's forward momentum. His soldiers dove for cover, firing at enemies they couldn't see while arrows came at them from above. I was on that ridge with a rifle I'd loaded myself and a view of the entire battlefield. I told myself I wasn't ready to kill army soldiers, that I still had some loyalty left to the uniform I'd once worn. But when I saw Webb, unmistakable even at distance, sitting his horse behind the lines like he always did, letting other men die for his ambitions, something cold settled into my chest. I thought about my father's forge burning. I thought about Pete and O'Connor walking toward me with a white flag. I thought about 5 years of hiding while this man kept destroying lives. I lined up the shot. 400 yards, wind from the southeast, maybe 5 miles per hour, slight downhill angle. My father's powder, my father's training, my aim. Webb never saw it coming. They say you never forget your first kill. They're wrong. You forget most of them eventually. They blur together into a smear of blood and noise and the copper taste of fear. The faces fade first, then the names, then even the circumstances. After enough years, enough bodies, they become nothing more than entries in a ledger you stopped keeping long ago. But you never forget the kill that matters. I watched Webb through my scope for what felt like an eternity, though it couldn't have been more than 10 seconds. 10 seconds to end 35 years of hatred. 10 seconds to close a wound that had been bleeding since I was 17 years old, standing in the ashes of my father's forge. He sat his horse the way he always did behind the lines, letting other men die for his ambitions. Even from 400 yards, I could see the arrogance in his posture, the certainty that he was untouchable, that God himself had blessed his every cruelty. My finger rested on the trigger, my father's powder in the cartridge, my father's training in my hands, and somewhere I like to think my father's ghost watching over my shoulder. Any fool can pull a trigger, he used to say, but knowing when to pull it, that's wisdom. I'd waited 35 years for this moment. I'd killed 3 of his accomplices in the dark, never giving them the chance to see my face. But Webb, I wanted to see me. I wanted him to know in that final instant exactly who had come for him. But 400 yards was too far for recognition. He would die confused, wondering which of his countless enemies had finally caught up with him. It would have to be enough. I exhaled slowly, letting my heartbeat steady. The crosswind had shifted maybe 7 miles per hour now, coming from the southeast. I adjusted my aim 2 inches to the right. The downhill angle meant the bullet would drop less than expected. I compensated, and then just before I squeezed the trigger, Webb turned his head. He was looking toward the ridge, looking toward me. For one impossible moment, our eyes seemed to meet across the impossible distance, and I saw something flicker across his face. Not recognition, he couldn't possibly see me clearly. But something, some instinct honed by years of making enemies. He knew. In that final second, Marcus Webb knew that death had found him. I pulled the trigger. The rifle kicked against my shoulder, harder than army issue thanks to the extra powder. The sound cracked across the canyon like thunder echoing off the walls until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Webb fell from his horse like a puppet with cut strings. There was no dramatic moment, no final words, no clutching at the wound or reaching toward the sky. One instant he was alive, and the next he was a corpse, tumbling through the air, hitting the ground in a cloud of dust that seemed almost gentle compared to the violence that had put him there. The battle ended 3 minutes later. His men surrendered those who could still stand. The rest lay scattered across the canyon floor, wounded or dead, or simply too broken to fight anymore. Comanche women moved among them with practiced efficiency, tending injuries with the same hands that had made the arrows causing them. They'd learned long ago that even enemies could be useful. A healed prisoner could be ransomed, traded, or put to work. A dead one was just weight to bury. I stayed on the ridge. I don't know how long I sat there, rifle across my knees, staring at the spot where Webb had fallen. Long enough for the sun to move. Long enough for the sounds of battle to fade into the quieter sounds of aftermath, moans of the wounded commands, shouted in Comanche, the nervous whickering of horses. Long enough for the emptiness to settle in. I'd expected Something. Satisfaction, maybe. The righteous glow of justice finally served, or relief the bone-deep exhaustion of a burden finally set down. Anything would have been better than this hollow ache, this terrible silence where 35 years of hatred had lived. Webb was dead. My enemy was gone. And I felt nothing at all. That's when Taabe found me. She climbed the ridge with the same effortless grace she brought to everything, barely breathing hard despite the steep terrain. Her bow was slung across her back, and there was blood on her hands. Enemy blood, I assume, though. With Taabe, you could never be certain. She sat down beside me without asking permission, close enough that our shoulders almost touched, close enough that I could smell the sweat and smoke and sage that clung to her skin. For a while, neither of us spoke. We just sat there watching the aftermath unfold below us. "It's done," she said finally. "Yes." "You feel nothing." I considered the question, turned it over in my mind like a stone I'd found in a riverbed, examining its weight and texture. "I thought I would feel something," I admitted. "Satisfaction, justice, relief." I lowered the rifle, setting it on the ground beside me, like a tool I no longer needed. "I just feel tired." "That is because revenge is empty." I looked at her. She was staring out at the canyon, her profile sharp against the fading sky. "It fills nothing," she continued. "It fixes nothing. It only ends things that should have ended long ago. The wound does not heal because you have killed the one who made it. The scar remains. The memory remains. All that changes is that you stop adding new blood to old. You sound like you've thought about this before." "I have buried a husband, a father, 2 brothers." Her voice was flat, reciting facts. "I have killed the men who took them from me, and I have learned that their deaths gave me nothing but more deaths to carry." "Then what's the point?" She turned to look at me, and for the first time I saw something soft beneath the warrior's mask. Not weakness. Taabe didn't have weakness, but something human, something that understood. "The point is that it is finished. The chapter ends. The book does not close. It never closes while you still breathe, but you can turn the page." She paused. "Now you can decide what to do with whatever time you have left. That is the gift revenge gives you. Not satisfaction, just possibility." I thought about that. Thought about all the years I'd spent running, hiding, nursing my hatred like a flame I was afraid to let die. What was left of me without it? "What do you do?" I asked. "When you've spent your whole life becoming something, and then suddenly that thing is gone, when the purpose that defined you just disappears." Taabe was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was gentler than I'd ever heard it. "You become something else. That is what living is constantly becoming. The child becomes the warrior becomes the elder becomes the ancestor. We are not meant to stay the same. Only the dead are unchanging." She stood brushing dust from her leggings with brisk, practical movements. "You are not dead, Eli Cutter, though you have pretended to be for 5 years. The question is whether you are ready to stop pretending." I looked up at her, this woman who had every reason to hate me and had chosen to give me a chance instead. "And if I stay here with your band..." Taabe's expression shifted, not quite a smile, but something close, something that acknowledged the weight of what I was asking. "Then you become Comanche, or you try." She didn't soften the truth. "It will not be easy. Many will never trust you. Others will test you until you break or prove yourself. You will fail at things that children master easily. You will be humiliated, frustrated, alone in ways you cannot imagine." Sounds appealing. It is not meant to appeal. It is meant to be honest. She looked down at me, her dark eyes reflecting the dying light. "But I will tell you this, we do not waste people. If you have value, we will find it. If you have strength, we will use it. And if you have loyalty..." She paused. "Loyalty is the rarest thing, more precious than horses or guns or gunpowder. If you have that, you will never be alone again." "And you..." The question came out before I could stop it. "What do you think of me?" Taabe studied me for a long moment. I felt like I was being weighed on some scale I couldn't see, measured against standards I didn't understand. "I think you have already proven yourself," she said finally. "You could have stayed hidden. You could have let Webb's men do what they wanted with our people and ridden away in the morning. Instead, you risked everything for strangers who would have killed you without hesitation. Maybe I'm just stupid. Maybe." A ghost of a smile crossed her face. "But I do not think so. I think you are a man who lost his way and is trying to find it again. That is not stupidity. That is courage." She offered me her hand, a gesture I hadn't seen her make with anyone. Not a handshake, not a pull-up. Just an open palm extended in the space between us like a bridge waiting to be crossed. "Come," she said. "We have wounded to tend and dead to bury. After that, you can decide what you want to become." I looked at her hand, calloused, strong, scarred across the knuckles. A hand that had killed and healed and built and destroyed. A hand that was offering me something I hadn't had in 35 years. A future. I took it and let her pull me to my feet. 3 months later, I sat in a hide shelter at the edge of camp, demonstrating the gunpowder process to 5 students. Tosa Mia and Nada were there, along with 3 others who'd proven they had the patience and precision the work required. I taught them everything, not just the formula, but the reasoning behind it. Why each step mattered, how to adapt when conditions weren't perfect. "The knowledge isn't worth anything if it dies with me," I told them. "Your children need to know this, and their children after that." "You will not live forever?" Nada asked, mock innocent. "Barely made it this far. I figure I'm on borrowed time." She laughed, and for a moment I felt something I hadn't felt in years, the warmth of belonging. Later that evening, Taabe came to find me. "Issa Tai wants to speak with you," she said, "about your place in the band." "Good or bad?" "Neither, just necessary." We walked together through the camp, passing cooking fires and playing children and warriors mending weapons. A few people nodded at me as we passed, not warmly but not with hostility either. Acknowledgement, acceptance of a fact they'd decided to live with. Issa Tai waited outside his shelter, smoking a pipe and watching the sunset paint the canyon walls in shades of red and gold. "Sit," he said. I sat. "You have been with us 3 moons now. You have kept your word, taught us the gunpowder, helped with the horses, fought beside us when needed." He took a long pull from his pipe. "Some of the elders think you should be adopted into a family, given a place, a name. What do you think?" "I think you are still a white man. That will never change." He looked at me sideways. "But I also think that what a man is matters less than what a man does. You have done well. I'm just trying to pay a debt. The debt was paid months ago. What you do now is something else." He stood stretched and started back toward his shelter. "Think about what you want Eli Cutter, then come tell me. We will decide together what you can become." I sat there until the stars came out, thinking about debts and deaths and the strange paths that lead us to places we never expected. Taabe found me there, still thinking. "You have decided?" she asked. "My father used to say that the man who makes the weapon decides who lives and who dies. I spent most of my life letting other people make that decision for me. The Army Webb, whoever was paying the bills." I looked up at her. "I want to make my own choice now. I want to stay. Not to pay a debt, not to hide from my past, because this is where I can do the most good." Taabe nodded slowly. "That is a good reason. Is it enough?" She sat down beside me closer than she ever had before. "We will find out together. Some men find home in a place. 4 walls, a roof, land they can point to and say, 'This is mine.' I found home in a purpose. The Comanche word for gunpowder translates roughly to thunder medicine. Over the years that followed, I became known as the man who made thunder, not a warrior, not a leader, just a craftsman doing work that mattered. My father would have understood. The knowledge I carried, his knowledge refined over generations, didn't die with me. It spread through the bands, taught and retaught, until it belonged to everyone and no one. The Army never could figure out where all those perfectly made cartridges were coming from, why the ammunition they captured never quite matched their own. I never told them. Some secrets are worth keeping. Taabe and I never married. That wasn't our way. But we rode together, fought together, and built something that neither of us could have built alone. When she died 30 years later, I buried her on a ridge overlooking the canyon where we'd first made our stand against Webb. I visit that ridge sometimes when my joints allow. I tell her about the grandchildren I've helped raise, about the young Smiths who've surpassed my skills, about the changes coming that neither of us could have imagined. I don't know how many years I have left. 87 is a long time to drag around a body that was never meant to last this long. But when I go, I'll go knowing one thing for certain. The forge my father built, the knowledge he gave me, the responsibility he placed on my shoulders, none of it was wasted. Some things are worth more than a lifetime. Some things deserve to be passed on. The end.